Okay, everyone. Well, congratulations on test one. Uh, had some really good grades, and that should give you some idea of the types of questions to expect. We're going to move on now to chapter two, and so chapters 2 and 3 are going to divide 50-50 on the test. Chapter 2 will be all about biology and how it affects kids in their development. And chapter 3 will be cognitive development. So expect 25 questions or so from each chapter, and they're fairly short chapters. One thing I would point out is chapter 2 is about puberty. So when we talk biology, we're of course talking about hormones, growth spurts, sexual development, and that sort of thing. So just understand we're talking primarily about early adolescence, the onset of puberty, and a 2-year growth spurt. So there's going to be a lot of information about that. If you have your PowerPoint, and I hope you do and you're following me, I'm looking at a couple of terms that you're definitely going to need to know on page 2. And this will come up a little later in the chapter, but I find it helpful if I explain it now because I use this information throughout. The first term is genotype, and your genotype is your basically your blueprint, your genetic blueprint. So if we had an analogy of someone wanting to build a building, then they would have a blueprint. They wouldn't actually see the building, but they would have the information and all the design of what that building would look like if it were complete. So the genotype is simply your blueprint, your genetic heritage of what you're going to turn out to be like, and that would involve, according to some people, everything about you, including your personality, your physical traits, and so on. For test purposes, just understand that a genotype is not something that you can observe. So you would have to look at a tissue sample, a blood sample, and then figure out that that particular genotype is associated with some sort of personality trait or height or some characteristic like that. The second term, though, is phenotype, and a phenotype is the actual physical manifestation or observable, measurable characteristic, if you will, of a genotype. So another analogy would be the genotype is the blueprint that people are looking at, but the phenotype would be the actual building that you could walk through and compare to the blueprint, and everything would be built pretty close to that design. The number of floors, where the different windows and so on would be in that building. So again, your phenotype, simply on a test, probably Tim's got blue eyes, Susie's got brown hair. Those are phenotypes. You can just simply observe those characteristics. John is 6 feet tall. Mary's got an IQ of 135. That's measurable, and we looked at that in chapter 1 on standardized testing, and so we can use that measurement, if you will. But mostly it's things you can just see. The thing the author goes into a little more detail about, though, with the genotype-phenotype relationship, that there is not a one-to-one relationship between a genotype and a phenotype. And what they're talking about is there's no guarantee that just because you have a predisposition, for instance, to be 6 feet tall, that's your plan, that's your genotype, that's your blueprint. You may only be 5'10", or you may be 6'2", but you're going to fall somewhere in that range. And so what I want you to pick up on at this point is, well, why wouldn't you be exactly 6 feet tall if that's the way you're designed? And the answer would be environmental influences. And that's what this chapter is about a lot. You're always looking at the biology, but the biology is going to be affected by the environment. So a person in an impoverished environment, lack nutrition, maybe contaminated water, a lack of medical services, might not reach 6 feet tall. But a person with all the benefits of good health, nutritional food, and and supportive parenting and so on might exceed 6 feet tall, but you're going to fall somewhere in that range, and they call that your reaction range, your reaction to the environment. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go through the different PowerPoints. On page 3, the growth curves. Again, this is more for language purposes that you need to know in the chapter. The general growth curve is one of the growth curves that we look at, and your general growth curve is going to be your physical traits, your bone structure, your height, your muscle mass, and so on. Some people are tiny, some people are large, some people are big boned, and some people are narrowly built. And so that's your general growth curve. We'll look at that when we look at the growth spurt and what can be expected along that general growth curve during puberty. Again, make sure, if I didn't tell you already, there's a definition of puberty. Memorize that definition, it'll be helpful. But it includes this rapid development that occurs during early adolescence, affecting both the physical or the general growth curve and the reproductive or sexual maturation curve. Which brings us to the next curve, and that's the reproductive growth curve. Your reproductive growth curve will be all of the hormones that affect the sexual maturation that young people experience during puberty. The brain and head growth curve is the third curve that I have in the outline. The main reason I want you to familiarize yourself with it, because both the other growth curves, the growth spurt or the rapid increase during puberty, will happen somewhere between 9.5 to 11.5 years of age at onset. But the brain head growth curve, it happens early on in a child's development. For instance, a newborn's head will be more developmentally advanced than the body. It will be disproportionate, and that'll be important, and I'll explain it to you later in another term that I want you to be aware of. On page 4, I have 4 factors that affect those growth curves, and at least 3 of the 4 will be on the test. So target seeking simply means, if we use my example of you have a genotype to be predisposed to grow to be 6 feet tall, that is your target. And so you're always striving to your program to try to reach 6 feet tall, and the only thing that might prevent that, again, would be the environmental influences. But still, if you could correct some sort of negative environment factor like poor nutrition and correct that, you're always going to try to seek your target. The second term is called maturity gradient, and again, I put a check mark by that one. Maturity gradient means that some parts of your body are more developmentally advanced than others, and that's what I meant by a newborn's head being larger in comparison to the body. And basically what they're telling you is that we don't just automatically grow symmetrically, but different portions of the body are more advanced at various stages than others. And when we get in the section on brain development, I'll point out to you what you need to know about the maturity gradient. The fourth, maybe it's the third, negative feedback regulation. I notice this gives students a lot of trouble on tests, and they seem to be having a hard time figuring out how this works. So what I've done here is put an analogy for you of a thermostat. So if we had a room that the temperature was 50 degrees and we want the room to be 70 degrees, there's going to be a thermostat that we could set for that temperature, and it's going to monitor that temperature of that room, and when it realizes it's not at 70, it's going to send a signal to a furnace somewhere in the building and have that turn on, and it's going to begin producing heat and pushing that heat into the room, and the thermostat's going to continue to monitor, and as it reaches the 70 degree mark, it will send another signal back to the furnace to turn it off, because we've reached that target. You go back to target setting, and it then says turn off the heat, quit pushing heat in the room. and that's negative feedback regulation. So you say, well, what's that got to do with biology? Well, I want you to think about what I've told you about a growth spurt, puberty, a rapid development over a 2-year period. At the onset, there's going to be a release of hormones at high levels, which we'll cover on another screen. Well, we have to have some sort of internal regulatory process that's monitoring that based on your genotype. So as you approach your target, we have to have some sort of mechanism to shut down those high levels of hormones and back off, for instance, a growth hormone. So let's use that one. That's an easy example. If you have a genotype that predisposes you to be 6 feet tall and you experience your general growth curve, it's going to kick in at the onset of puberty, and for the next 2 years, you're going to have high levels of growth hormones in the system. And so there's going to be a rapid growth spurt. But you have to have something that's monitoring that says, hey, when I get close to the 6 feet tall, what's going to keep me from becoming 7 feet tall? Well, that internal monitoring process is called negative feedback regulation. And in particular, the hypothalamus gland is monitoring that. It has your blueprint, and it's going to send a signal to your pituitary gland, which is going to produce hormones that the first time at the onset increase the levels of growth hormone to achieve its target, but towards the end, it's got to have some mechanism to shut it back down. So when the hypothalamus interacts with the pituitary gland, it sends different hormones, in which tells the thyroid gland, for instance, to quit producing these high levels as you approach your target. And they call that negative feedback regulation. The fourth factor affecting those growth curves is called body mass. And body mass is more of an external factor. So this is, in the case with the negative feedback regulation, while they're monitoring hormones internally through the various glands and hormones, body mass is really monitoring your external or skeletal, meaning your body mass index, your weight, percentage of body fat that a person has. So in the book, the author specifically talks about some research in which they were studying menarche in young girls that were experiencing the onset of puberty and what triggers that. And so what they believe is going on there related to body mass is that when a young girl reaches percentage 17% of body fat, that for some reason triggers menarche. The other thing that they believe may be going on is an overall body weight of 106 pounds, give or take 3 pounds. So somewhere between 103 and 109 pounds, with 106 being the average, could also trigger menarche during puberty for young girls. And so those are the 4 factors affecting the growth curves that I want you to be familiar with. Also on page 6, I've done a flow chart for you. This is in your book in a narrative form, and it lays out the different glands that I want you to be aware of for the test. So I'm looking at 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different glands. So memorize these glands. You want to know what their function is, what are they there for, what do they do, and if they're producing hormones, what impact are these hormones having on the system. So I'm just going to follow the flow chart from the top down. So the first one on that screen is hypothalamus. The hypothalamus is in the upper portion of the brain, and its main function is to monitor all sorts of things that are going on with the individual. So for instance, your hypothalamus monitors your appetite. It lets you know you're hungry. It lets you know you're full. It monitors thirst. You're thirsty, or you quench your thirst. It monitors sleep. You're tired, you're rested. But it also monitors the other glands as far as your growth spurt and your target of 6 feet. We'll keep using that example and so on. And so it really interacts with these other glands. It's in the upper portion of the brain. So basically its function is to monitor, internal monitoring. The next gland there is pituitary gland. The pituitary gland also interacts with the hypothalamus, and at the onset of puberty, when the hypothalamus releases these hormones, we'll call them chemicals, through the bloodstream, it's going to trigger the pituitary gland to begin producing certain hormones, depending on the various growth curves that are occurring. Let's take the simplest one first, and that would be the one to the right if you follow the arrow. It releases hormones to the thyroid gland that's located in the neck region, and the thyroid gland is going to begin producing growth hormones at a high level, almost like if you had a faucet just drip, 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 and now you open the valve wide open, and it just starts flooding the system. And so that will continue throughout this 2-year growth spurt until the hypothalamus is monitoring that as you approach your target of whatever growth in your general growth curve you're designed to be based on your genotype. Then the hypothalamus is monitoring that closely, and that's what I mean about the negative feedback regulation. It will send another set of chemicals or hormones to the pituitary gland, which will produce different hormones and go to the thyroid gland that says shut down that high level of production. On the left side of that screen, you see the sex glands or gonads, and I have that divided for you, testes and ovaries. So let's take it on the far left as the testes. The main class of hormones that will be produced during the growth spurt along the reproductive growth curve, which has to do with the young people's sexual development, sexual maturation, is called androgens. So androgen is the primary or main class hormone produced in males during puberty. On the right, the ovaries during this time for females are going to produce the hormone of estrogen. Be careful on the test, because if the question is what is the main class or general class hormone produced, for instance, in males, you're going to pick androgens, in females, you're going to pick estrogen. But if the question says what is the specific hormone produced in androgens, or what specific type of androgen is produced in males during puberty, then if you look below, you're going to see in a smaller print testosterone. That's a specific type of hormone that increases 18-fold. That means 18 times its normal level during this 2-year growth spurt. For females, the specific hormone, or the specific type, if you will, of estrogen is estradiol, and it will experience, the young person will experience an 8-fold increase. When those hormones increase, they specifically have to do with your sexual maturation, in primary and secondary characteristics. There's some naughty pictures in your book. You can look and see the pictures and see how that works. Right? My wife's trying to make me smile. Okay. Let's see if we can squeeze this in. The physical growth curve on page 7, I have it divided left and right, female, male, but just under the physical growth spurt, you'll see 2 years earlier for girls and boys. So what they're basically telling you is girls are going to experience their growth spurt or puberty 2 years before boys even start. And the growth spurt lasts for 2 years. So that should tell you when the girls are finishing, the boys are just getting started in their growth spurt. And so if you memorize some of the information on the left, like the onset for girls, it's around 9 to 9.5 years of age. Well, that should tell you automatically, you can just do the math, that boys are going to begin experiencing the onset, that means the beginning of puberty, around 11 to 11.5 years of age. And then again, do the math, if it lasts 2 years, then the apex, meaning the height or the end of it, for girls, it's going to be around 11 to 11.5 years of age, again, 2 years. And for males, about 13 to 13.5, 14, somewhere in there. There's no exact number, but that's approximate. I would pay attention, though, to the weight and height that these young people experience. For instance, for girls, they're going to grow about 3.5 inches per year throughout their growth spurt. and they're going to gain an average of about 18 pounds per year during the growth spurt. For males, it's going to be about 4 inches per year and about 20 pounds per year. So be careful on the test, because the test may say, what is the average growth spurt during puberty for females? Well, you don't want to pick 3.5, because that's just for 1 year. If it's throughout the entire period of puberty, 2 years, the average growth spurt would be 7 inches, right? And for males, it would be about 8 inches, because it's 2 years, you have to double the numbers. But if it says per year, then go with the numbers that you see on the chart there. Okay, well, I'm trying to keep these lectures brief enough for you to digest and have time to go look it up in the book and study. So that's about the extent of what I've been going, around 20 minutes or so. So that'll be it for today, and I'll try to have another lecture for you on Wednesday.